Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Vilmarie Narlock, and I am here with Kelly and Nick, and we are reviewing our Just Say No Peer Education Training Curriculum lesson on drug policy. So it's our Drug Policy 101 lesson. It's the third lesson of our training curriculum for our peer education program. We're going to go ahead and get started. So for this particular lesson, the idea is for our peer educators to understand the history and the roots of drug policy, the impact of drug policy on the use and misuse of psychoactive substances, and understanding how that is different by social status, race, class, gender, etc. And to understand the impact of drug policy on mainstream conceptions of drugs and people who use drugs today. Okay, so we have two types of drug laws. There's sort of the regulation laws. So these are similar to laws regulating the safety of other products, so things like cars and toys. So we also have the regulation of like legal drugs via pharmaceutical companies, pharmacists, physicians, and all of the others who manufacture and dispense drugs. And then there are criminalization types of laws. So this is essentially making it a criminal offense to use, possess, or sell. And this is similar to other behaviors like gambling and prostitution, as far as that kind of law. So we're going to go right into this video. This is a clip from the movie The House I Live In, which is a highly recommended resource as far as understanding sort of the history of prohibition in the US. And this is a really great clip that kind of underlines the history of where we came to our drug laws and how we came to our drug laws in America.
Looking to find out more about the longer history of drugs in America, I found an unlikely source in Lincoln historian Richard Miller. His research put drug laws in a fascinating historical context.
Historically, anti-drug laws have always been associated with race. In the 1800s, certain kinds of drugs that are illicit today were common in this country. Cocaine was widely used, heroin. People using drugs was something that was just ordinarily accepted. Opium, for example, was used by middle-aged, successful whites, often housewives in the South. If people were addicted or abusing drugs, they were viewed sympathetically as people who had to be helped. It was seen as a public health issue rather than a crime issue. Well, one of the first changes was on the West Coast, when smoking opium was made a criminal offense. Now, why would opium smoking be illegal in California but not in Mississippi? What was going on in California that was a concern about smoking opium? Well, as it turns out, it had nothing to do with opium itself. The concern was with the people associated with smoking opium, and that was the Chinese who had come to this country, and many of whom were in California, working hard, working for very little pay, and becoming part of the American success story. But their success was taking jobs away from white workers. So politicians got together and decided they got to find something about the Chinese for which they can be criminalized to get them out of the way. Now, of course, you can't throw people in jail simply because they're Chinese, but you can throw them in jail because they smoke opium. In the same way, we saw things going on with cocaine. Again, it was middle-aged, successful people in this country, business executives, physicians, housewives, all perfectly legal. But then around the turn of the century, cocaine began being associated with blacks. They could withstand police bullets, it was thought. They can work hard all day, all night long, and all day long again, threatening the jobs of white workers. And so laws began to be passed against cocaine. You're not arresting these people officially because they're black. You're arresting them because they've committed some sort of drug violation. Next, of course, we see the change in reputation that hemp has had. Hemp was a legitimate crop from colonial times forward, a widely appreciated commercial product. But then in the 1930s, hemp changed into something vicious and fearsome called marijuana, because at that time, marijuana smoking was being associated with Mexicans, working hard, working cheap. And once again, what was being outlawed was not being Mexican, but just some habit associated with Mexicans. These laws set up a very dangerous precedent of racial control.
It seemed that time and again, drug laws targeted any immigrant group seen as a threat to the established economic order. But how then did Black Americans, who came to this country over 200 years ago, become the primary target of drug laws in the modern era?
Well, the way to think about African American history in the 20th century is as an immigrant story. I mean, the transition from the rural to the urban, it's one of the great mass migrations in the history of the world.
When blacks came out of slavery, they were heavily concentrated in the South in farming-type jobs. As industries were expanding in the North, blacks were recruited to come to work in factories. This gave rise to the great migration of blacks flowing into urban areas.
Before she came to work for my family, Nanny Jeter had joined the wave of Black Americans who'd moved north during the Great Migration. She took me down to her childhood home in Southern Virginia.
We grew up rumbling through the woods with a beautiful outside life. The old Victoria would play and somebody would square dance, and it was a completely different world. I love life in the South.
Now, in that environment that seems so wonderful in the South, why did you ever decide you wanted to leave the South?
I left the South because I had to. Jim Crow, during that time, you couldn't, black people, if they was raped, they couldn't say they was raped. So you never hear of rape. Only the white lady got raped, but the black woman, I was innocent, but people didn't think I was innocent. No one knew I was leaving. I wanted to bring my children up different. North was the way out. I thought it would make a big difference.
Nanny had never spoken so openly about her past and what it was that had compelled her north. But as I learned more about her life, I began to see the deeper roots of the drug war for Black American families like Nanny's.
Sadly, what many of these families came to find is that they had not really escaped Jim Crow at all, but found themselves in a new system of racial control, a new Jim Crow. Racially discriminatory laws across America ensured that poor people of color migrating from the South would be confined to certain parts of the city that we now think of as ghettos.
Very few people know this, but if you go back and you look at how African American housing patterns were established in the 30s and 40s, even as a result of the New Deal, the FHA, which was a Democratic New Deal program to inspire home ownership in the midst of the Depression, did more to create ghettos than any other federal program before or since. Why? Because when they were creating the culture of home ownership in America, they were exclusionary to black people. They put them in the areas that were maybe a little bit economically depressed and subject to heavy rentership, and then they redlined those areas and they would not write FHA mortgages in those neighborhoods. Once those areas were redlined, that was basically a design for a ghetto.
In 1950, people in these neighborhoods were poor, but they had jobs. By 1960, we're talking about the jobless poor, because industries had moved out of the inner city, leaving behind concentrated populations of poor people, vulnerable to drug trafficking and all of the other problems associated with joblessness.
And what happens when groups are denied access to the core economic engines in a society? They create their own out of prohibited economies. That was true of the Italians and the Irish and the Jews and everybody else who came to the cities a generation before African Americans arrived.
Okay, so as you can see, this clip, I really like it in the sense that it really helps us show the pattern of prohibition as it relates to particular groups, and particularly the racism of the drug laws in America. So going back a little bit, back to the days of patent medicines. And in the early 1800s, opium was the most reliable and effective medicine that we had, and it was used for a lot of stuff. So especially pain relief, as it remains now. And it was really prescribed widely. At that point, pure morphine from opium in the 1830s, and then with the development in the the development of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s, we then had a much more potent delivery method. And that started to lead to some concerns about dependence on opium and morphine. And so we used to have a term for it called morphinism, similar to like alcoholism. And then with this legal distribution of patent medicines, they were dispensed by traveling peddlers and in local stores for self-medication. But a conflict arose due to this concern of the content of these drugs, because a lot of them contain a high concentration of alcohol or cocaine. So again, there was concerns about whether the therapeutic claims were accurate, and selling and dispensing these medications that had sort of habit-forming contents. And this is a snippet here from Collier's Great American Fraud. So this is a publication that came out in October of 1905. And this issue of this magazine sort of culminated a prolonged attack on these patent medicines, with a really sort of well-documented and aggressive, sort of negatively aggressive series against patent medicines. So you can kind of see here is just some of the language used in this little clip that we have. And so that sort of really started and sort of catapulted the concern. So again, and then early, getting back to the mid 1800s, there are a lot of British and American merchants that were involved in the sale of opium to the Chinese. And a lot of world leaders at the time didn't really like this. They disapproved of this. And so in 1833, the US signed the first treaty agreeing to control the opium trade and tax any crude opium imported into the US. And that was legislated in 1842. And that was like kind of the first time that they became involved in the international drug trade. And of course, US imported Chinese workers after the Civil War to help build our railroads. And with them, some of them brought home the habit of smoking opium, and that spread, and that seemed to kind of upset the status quo. And in 1875, we had our first ordinance in San Francisco, which was the first law in the US prohibiting opium smoking. And in 1882, New York passed a similar law focused on the Chinatown neighborhood. And in 1890, we have our first federal act that permitted only Americans to import opium or manufacture smoking opium in the US. And of course, it was viewed as a racial policy, but it was actually in response to an agreement with China forbidding American citizens from engaging in the Chinese opium trade. And then, we of course had opium dens in that time, and those became outlawed. And of course, as a result, sort of illicit market opium, in costs of opium increased in the illicit market, and lower class opium users, quote unquote, took up other options. So they started using morphine or heroin. And so again, you can kind of see, as was described in that video, the sort of role of racism in all of these laws. And with regard to cocaine, similar to opium, it was available in the mid-1800s, and of course the use increased. By 1900, it was in a lot of patent medicines and tonics, including most famously Coca-Cola. Let's see, in 1885, it had just 2 medicinal ingredients in Coca-Cola. It was the actual extract of coca leaves and cola nuts. By 1902, there was as little as 1 in 400 of a grain of cocaine per ounce of syrup. And it didn't become completely cocaine-free until 1929, which is a fun fact. At that time, any of these sort of patent medicines and tonics, they were available by mail order, and you could get them in pharmacies, apothecaries, things like this. But of course, medical experts started to raise some concerns about the effects of these medicines and the overuse of these medicines. And then in the early 1900s, we again have an issue raised that cocaine sniffing was common among Southern Black folks and was responsible for an increase in violence by those folks in the sort of lower class of Black folks in the South. This, of course, was an unsubstantiated fear that, of course, was spread for the benefit of garnering support for federal drug control laws, particularly from getting support from the southern states. There had been, typical opposition to increased federalism at this time, but they sort of used this sort of racist rhetoric and fear tactics to gain that kind of support in the South. And we have the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. So that was one of the first things that we start seeing sort of federally. In 1905, Teddy Roosevelt recommended a law to regulate interstate commerce in any sort of misbranded and adulterated food and drugs. And sort of based on Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed some unsanitary conditions of meat packing in the meat packing districts. So we had the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. And that sort of was the introduction of the federal government into the drug marketplace. And so they were specifically referred to alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, cannabis, and some other things. And so packages were required to state how much of the drug was in the preparation of what was in the package. And as long as it was clearly labeled, any drug could be bought and sold without restriction. So the goal was to protect people mostly from shady merchants, not necessarily from their own dependence on these substances. But of course, this provided the basis for all of our modern laws regulating pharmaceuticals. And of course, it was later amended for testing for safety and testing for effectiveness as well. And then we have the Harrison Act of 1914. In the early 1900s, Dr. Hamright decided that the US could gain some trading status with China again by helping China reduce this opium importation. So the US requested an international conference to discuss controlling the opium trade. Great Britain wanted morphine, cocaine, and heroin included, but because these products from Germany were replacing opium as that was being controlled. So a lot of different nations agreed to control international and domestic sale and use of these different drugs. And so Dr. Wright drafted a bill that was submitted by Senator Harrison. And so basically what it looked like was that anyone that was a dealer or a dispenser of opioids and cocaine had to register each year, and they paid a fee, and they had special order forms. Doctors and vets were considered lawful distributors if they were registered. So they had a tax law similar to like the whiskey tax, where it wasn't punitive, so the penalties were not severe and didn't mention the users of the drug. So it was more about the dispensation of the drugs. But of course, there was some concern about inconvenience to physicians and pharmacists. But still supported sort of legality, right? So Dr. Wright tried to include some additional controls. So as far as like route of administration, so he tried to include sniffing cocaine, which is of course the route of administration that was most common among Southern Black folks. So he wanted to sort of further criminalize that. And he was one of the folks that was saying that, causing concern and fear that sniffing cocaine led to the raping of white women. He also, there was also talk of the immoral Chinese opium dens. And so it was sort of necessary, this necessary sort of commentary that helped them garner support for this bill. So once again, using that sort of fear-mongering and alarmist and racist tactics to get support. And this is really the sort of seed that was planted that has since sprouted all other federal controlled substance regulations. At this point, individual use or possession is still not criminalized, and doctors could still prescribe these medications. So under this, we have two basic laws that influence drug regulation. We've got this Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, And that was mostly overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, with the goal being that drugs are pure and honestly labeled. So again, it was about labeling, it's about regulating what was actually in the drug. And then the Harrison Act was actually where the Treasury Department was essentially became responsible for enforcing prohibition. So the goal here was the taxation of drugs to restrict commerce in opioids and cocaine to physicians, pharmacists, and legitimate manufacturers only. These laws were, of course, further shaped by the court. They obviously became different from their initial intentions over the years, but this is sort of what they were initially intended to do. So with that, and the regulation of pharmaceuticals and sort of how that purity piece comes into play with the Pure Food and Drug Act, again, the contents must be accurately listed on the label, right? And larger companies made efforts to comply with this law, but they weren't really given any recommendations as to how they were to do that. So it caused some problems as far as like the rollout and the implementation of this law. The FDA tested products and went after anything that was adulterated or didn't list their active ingredients. They also regulated any false claims. The therapeutic claims piece wasn't really covered in the initial law, so that was one thing that they added later on. So the Shirley Amendment in 1912 was included to outlaw false claims. But it was still up to the government to prove that those claims were false and fraudulent. And it initially encouraged voluntary cooperation at first with the law, but they later worked to improve quality standards to address any sort of poor manufacturing practices that led to any unintentional issues. So smaller companies still produced quack medicine that was ineffective and are dangerous because it was harder for them to remain compliant because of how they needed to show that. The Depression, so the 1930s, really increased competition for business, and the Roosevelt administration took a really critical view of the pharmaceutical industry. So more than 10% of drugs didn't meet the standards at the time, and attempts were made to reform the industry, but there was just a lot of opposition, and it really prevented that. So as early as the 1930s, we were trying to like put some a little bit more regulation on the pharmaceutical industry because so many of the drugs didn't meet standards, and we got pushback even then. And then the next piece of that was the issue of safety. So again, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, there wasn't really any legal requirement that the medications be safe. So for example, in the 1930s, we had these sulfa drugs that were used as antibiotics. And it seems like a good thing. There was a particular chemical called sulfanilamide, that could be dissolved, and it seemed like it could be a good thing as an antibiotic. So it was bottled and sold. Unfortunately, the actual thing that it was dissolved into, this diethylene glycol, causes kidney poisoning. So whoops. So 170 people died from taking this antibiotic combination. And the government couldn't intervene just because the mix was toxic, because there were no legal requirements for medications to be safe. So the FDA seized the elixir on the grounds that it contained alcohol. It didn't. The chemist committed suicide, the initial chemist that sort of discovered this. The company had to pay a big fine. There was a public crisis. And this is what led to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So the critical piece here was that before a drug could be marketed, the maker has to test for toxicity and submit a new drug application that includes full reports of all the studies that show the safety of the drug. And this then changed the role of the FDA from testing and challenging to more sort of gatekeeper reviewing of each new drug before it goes to market. So it increased the FDA's power and responsibility, also limited new drug production by any sort of small and untrained companies. And then, of course, we have drug labels needing to give instructions for how to use it, or that it should only be used by prescription. And this is where they sort of recognize the differentiation between over-the-counter versus prescription-only medications. And then we've got the effectiveness piece. So the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, again, no real legal requirements that medications be effective, but obviously that changed eventually. So in the late 1950s, the Senate investigated any high drug costs and marketing. So there was a concern that some widely sold over-the-counter medications were sort of probably ineffective. And of course, again, there was no law that required them to actually do anything. And they had some amendments that were written but didn't quite pass. So it really took a lot to raise public awareness about it. And it was a disaster, another disaster that happened. There was a sedative, thalidomide, which was marketed in Germany in the 50s, that was used by pregnant women because it helped with nausea and vomiting. And an American company submitted a new drug application to market it, but the FDA didn't approve it right away. And then in 1961 and 1962, it was found to be responsible for birth defects and caused hundreds of children in West Germany to be born with deformed limbs. So fortunately, it was avoided in the US because it was never approved here, but it did result in a bit of a scare. So in 1962, the Kefauver and Harris amendments added some provisions. So the companies have to seek approval of testing to be done with humans before conducting any clinical trials, and required ads for prescription drugs in medical journals to contain a summary of side effects. So this required that each new drug be demonstrated to be effective for illnesses on their label, and that has to be research that had to be submitted to the FDA. The FDA also had to begin review of products marketed since 1938 to determine effectiveness, and anything that was found ineffective was taken off the market. And then in 1966, the FDA began the process of evaluating prescription drugs, and they removed over 6,000 drugs from the market in the following 8 years after they started that process. That's a lot. That was not effective. So, and as far as introducing a new drug, the entire process takes over 10 years and costs, more than $1 billion for each drug. So if we think about right now, a big thing, at least in our world, is MDMA for PTSD-assisted therapy. Or I should say MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And that is something that's being taken on by MAPS. That is taken, quite a long time, right? And it costs a lot of money. They're always doing fundraisers and things like that, and this is why. So first off is these are preclinical research and development. So the company will submit an IND, so that's a Notice of Claimed Investigational Exemption for a new drug. And then there's the clinical research and development phase. So phase one, we want to know how the drug is absorbed and how it's excreted. So this is low doses, 20 to 80 healthy volunteers. So that's, the first phase of clinical research. And then it's usually just, we're looking for safety, right? And then the next phase is the initial effectiveness testing. So a few hundred folks who could benefit. So in the case of MDMA-assisted therapy, that's folks with PTSD. And in phase three, it's the broader effectiveness testing. So you're looking at typically 1,000 to 5,000 patients. So essentially expanding that initial effectiveness testing to a greater or broader set of participants. And that's where we are right now with MDMA. So this is some additional legislation that's been sort of added to this whole process. The Orphan Drug Act 1983, this is an act that looks at developing drugs for very rare disorders. And for this, you may receive tax and other financial incentives to get this kind of process, this kind of research going. And then the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1988. This is the regulating free samples to physicians. So oftentimes pharmaceutical companies will give a lot of free samples to physicians, and kind of creating a bit of a monopoly over certain drugs. And in 1997, it's the FDA Modernization Act, and this allowed included some guidelines for sort of post-marketing reporting of adverse effects and any distribution of information on off-label uses. So the Modernization Act, that's almost seen like phase 4 when we're looking at this new drug application sort of process. So it's the sort of marketing, understanding what the adverse effects might be and any off-label uses. So again, as far as legislation of controlled substances, our early enforcement, that 1914 Harrison Act, like I mentioned before, is essentially the narcotics division interpretation led to a lot of criminalization of drug use. And of course, the term narcotics is kind of a misleading term when it comes to this stuff, though it's used as sort of a blanket term to refer to illicit drugs. The initial enforcement was specifically on narcotics, but of course it has expanded to lots of other things, as we know. And until the 20s, people could receive controlled opioids through their doctor or through a pharmacist, though there was one arrest of a Dr. Webb who was prescribing over the phone, which is a new technology at the time. And that had some repercussions as to how the law would be enforced. The 18th Amendment was a prohibition. That's sort of the most important piece of legislation with regard to enforcement. So the Prohibition Unit created in 1919 with the Narcotics Division sort of falling under it, and believed that the cure for dependence was, of course, to prevent the supply and access to it. So a lot of physicians supplying to those who were now dependent on a substance would be charged under the Harrison Act. And another consequence of arresting doctors and pharmacists was the development of the illegal drug market. And at that point, of course, it's 50% or 50 times more expensive than what the retail market was. And dependence at the time was seen as a criminal issue, not a medical one. And so anyone that was a user must have gotten it illegally at this point, and thus was charged with violating the Harrison Act, which again was not the actual intent of that act. And then with regard to prison, right? So by 1928, drug violations made up 1/3 of the federal prison population. There's twice as many for drugs than for liquor. In 1929, Congress saw that as a really expensive issue and that people should be getting treatment. They established narcotic farms in 1935 in order to treat people who were convicted of violating the federal law. The Jones-Miller Act doubled the maximum penalties for dealing illegally imported drugs. So it doubled that to $5,000 and 10 years in prison. So even mere possession was sufficient for this kind of conviction, this level of conviction. And heroin became kind of the most preferred drug at the time. It was potent, so you kind of got more bang for your buck, so to speak. And in 1924, there was an act that prohibited importing opium for the manufacture of heroin. So people who are using it were considered criminals, of course. This also led to the growth of the illicit market being addressed with harsher penalties. So the focus was on getting rid of heroin, which was, of course, not the problem. And in 1925, it was legal still for doctors to prescribe heroin as part of a treatment program. Though by this point, they would have nothing to do with people who are using for users. Okay, so then we formed the Bureau of Narcotics in 1930 within the Treasury Department. So this is where Harry Anslinger was deemed the first drug czar. So he had pledged to stop arresting so many users and to try to go after the big dealers. So he was sort of following the lead of Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, and he built up a lot of power and influence, took over almost all of the control of drug education, prevention, treatment, and enforcement for 30 years. And after reports were made linking marijuana with crime, Anslinger made it his new cause and dedicated his efforts to depicting the evils of marijuana. So a lot of the things that you saw in that first video, that was happening under sort of his eye, right, under his watch. And he really succeeded in getting public support for this Marijuana Tax Act. So that brought marijuana, which is, of course, what the terminology that they were using at the time, under the same legal control as other drugs, in that one had to register and pay a tax to buy it, to import it or sell it. So it was considered a narcotic under federal law until 1970. World War II caused a decrease in drug imports, but at the end of the war, we saw an increase in international travel and trade picked up again, which increased every year, despite the 1951 Boggs Amendment to the Harrison Act, which introduced some of those mandatory minimums for drug offenses. And then there was a 1955 statement that communist China was trying to demoralize the US by getting US citizens hooked on drugs. So this 1956 act, the Drug Abuse Control Act Amendments of 1956, basically led to any offense except a first offense, possession, resulting in jail time, no suspension, no probation, no parole. If you're caught selling to a minor, you could get the death penalty. And then the early 60s saw an increase in illegal drug use. So we had these 1965 amendments where we started to introduce new classes of drugs like hallucinogens or psychedelics and barbiturates. And by the late 60s, it was clear that reform was needed, especially since use and problematic use was still increasing. So this 1970s law, this Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, it was supposed to sort of clear everything out, helping us start fresh. We were going to be doing stuff based on research and taking a rational approach to balancing public health with law enforcement. We were supposed to have some funding for research, treatment, and prevention. Some drugs could be controlled directly versus taxing or commerce. And so we introduced that under the DEA because taxation was no longer seen as a viable strategy. So we got rid of mandatory minimum sentencing. We got rid of the death penalty for selling to minors. We were considering the best available evidence. And that started the scheduling of drugs. So using actual scientific evidence, we were scheduling drugs, right? And we still have this sort of basic structure today. So this is sort of what our controlled substance schedule looks like, where Schedule 1 drugs are considered to have a high potential for abuse, and that is their terminology, that it has no accepted medical use, and that has a lack of accepted safety. Now you can see in the examples that we have cannabis or marijuana, again, this is the terminology that they use, and MDMA. And many of you will know that particularly for those two substances, for those two drugs, there has been actually some research that has shown, one, that there is an accepted level of safety, particularly with MDMA and the clinical trials that are happening right now for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and that there's some potential medicinal use. And again, with some of this research, we're showing that, at least for those couple of substances there is not a very high potential for misuse or abuse. So those alone are a pretty good example of how this the scheduling system isn't very accurate and is no longer really considering science. And so that is resulting because, or we have that because we sort of went backwards. So in the 80s, we introduced some amendments to this Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. And that sort of stiffened the possession and selling penalties. And this is also where we introduce the disparities in crack to powder cocaine sentencing. So again, without any pharmacological justification, but rather crack's sort of misguided and inaccurate association with violence, the mandatory minimums and the punishment for possession of crack versus powder cocaine saw a 1 to 100 disparity, with powder or crack cocaine being punished 100 times worse than powder cocaine. And we did see a sort of loosening of this in the mid to late 2000s, right? So around 2007 to 2010, we worked on loosening this to 1 to 18 as the disparity. Still not perfect because they are literally the same thing, literally the same substance, but seen sort of very differently. So in 1988, we also introduced some amendments to control any sort of drug paraphernalia. So anything that someone might use to use a drug, and also guns, anything, you know, essentially that a user would use. So this was really targeted at users to control that paraphernalia. In 1984, we also had that scheduling, right? So that previous slide, essentially, it was supposed to be in the hands of the Secretary of Health. However, we sort of overturned that logic of scheduling based on you know, health data and actual science by putting it in the hands of the DEA. So the Drug Enforcement Agency then had the power over the scheduling of our substances. So that's actually how we were able to put MDMA at Schedule 1 in 1984, because that switch from being under the Secretary of Health, who was concerned with science, to being under the DEA. And so this point about any sort of control of drug precursors, so this can include any raw material that in one step could be made into the substance that is controlled. So in 1988, the DEA was monitoring chemicals that could be used to make any illegal drugs, anything that could be used to create or extract certain chemicals. So for example, even something like over-the-counter Sudafed, which is ephedrine, which can be extracted to make methamphetamine. That was one of the ones that got introduced in 2005. So they updated this in 2005 to require us to show ID and to sign a thing in order to get some effective decongestants when we have a cold. And this also established the Office of National Drug Control Policy in 1988. So that established the position of the Director of the National Drug Control Policy, who we call the Drug Czar. So they're supposed to prepare the drug control strategy and the budget for all federal agencies involved. And they were given even more authority in 1998. So we can sort of see here this figure showing us the association with when anti-drug abuse acts started in the 80s, right? And the correlation to the prison population. So see 1985 and then starting in 1990, a really significant jump all the way to where we are around now. This obviously only goes to 2010, but you can see that it's just a ridiculous sort of shift up there. There are some sort of state and local differences here. There tends to be uniformity as far as local regulations with over-the-counter and prescription drugs. Some details will differ. After the act in 1970, some states adopted what is essentially a uniform sort of blanket Controlled Substances Act, which was a state law that the DEA recommended. So they kind of put out this law as a recommendation to all states. And that has the same scheduling for most drugs. Some might have some different breakdowns or more categories depending on the state, or they've kind of created their own very different categories. Differences in penalties, so for example, cocaine possession was also going to depend on the state. Federal charges are usually worse, of course, with regard to like mandatory minimums, for example. And of course, federal law does trump state law. So That's a concern, of course, for people that are legalizing or decriminalizing drugs. So, for example, in the not too distant past with the legalization of cannabis in various states, even though the feds said that they were not going to sort of come after these dispensaries and these cannabis companies, there was some federal raids that were happening. So this is why we're trying to now sort of address that that disparity in the laws. So with regard to the impact of drug enforcement, budget is a big one, right? It started at $1 billion in the 80s once these things were sort of ramping up, and it's grown to over $26 billion in 2012. With regard to international programs, the DEA has agents all over the world, essentially, or supposedly, helping countries by developing new crops, and we'll see a little bit of that in a video coming up here. So what they are doing is they're locating and destroying any illegal crops, any illegal labs. They're interfering with the trade. They've increased military aid and training, allegedly only to countries not engaging in human rights violations, but we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So you know that Homeland Security, that takes over 20% of the budget for drug enforcement, goes to Homeland Security. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, they test the urine test pilots. They also track small airports and private aircrafts. Agriculture and parks, so the National Park Service, they're looking out for marijuana crops on federal land, that kind of thing. So some of the other costs associated with drug enforcement is, of course, maintaining prisons and caring for prisoners. That's a huge one. We have hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It is very expensive to hold someone in prison. This does not often, or we don't often think about people that are on probation, that are on parole, or in juvenile detention. That also incurs a very significant cost. You know, there's crimes committed to purchase drugs. If you're, you know, if with some enforcement, it has resulted in increased prices. So that means that, you know, people who may be dependent on a drug or need to use a particular drug to maintain their functioning might have to engage in petty crimes in order to get resources to access their drug of choice. There's also, you know, corruption in law enforcement, and with regard to the actual agents, the DEA agents, and law enforcement having to get involved in sort of the drug trafficking or other sorts of communities, into the sort of unregulated market, they're sort of having to break the law to get the in. This leads in a lot of corruption in our law enforcement too. And our interest in controlling drugs is in conflict with national security. So we're sort of making some compromises that we shouldn't, because like I said in the last slide, we're supposed to only really be providing aid to those countries who are not committing human rights violations. A good example of where this kind of isn't the case is Afghanistan, where we gave them money to sort of address the heroin trade. And then a few months later, we were at war with them, and opium production actually increased. And then there's a loss of individual freedom. We're subject to violating urinalysis testing, searches and seizures of our property, people having access to our financial records, things like this. And with all of this, with all of these costs, drug use has not been eliminated. And in some cases, some drugs, the prices of which have actually decreased since the 80s. So for example, cocaine, the price of cocaine has decreased since the 80s, despite record-breaking seizures that, again, cost a lot of money as far as enforcement is concerned. With regard to effectiveness of these control strategies, again, about 10 to 15% of our illegal drug supply is seized each year. And when supplies are restricted, of course, prices go up. higher prices and increased difficulty in obtaining drugs may deter some folks, but like I said, it can also be associated with increase in petty crime and other crimes of access in order to try to gain resources to purchase the drugs. And there is also the concept that some folks might not have gone to treatment, for example, if they weren't arrested and not offered the option of treatment. However, we have a very large imbalance of resources going to enforcement and criminalization and prison versus actual treatment. So that's something that, perhaps if we were to actually balance out those resources a little bit better, we might be providing, services that people need and can access rather than being put in prison.
Over 40 years ago, US President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy #1, starting an unprecedented global campaign, the War on Drugs. Today, the numbers are in. The war on drugs is a huge failure with devastating unintended consequences. It led to mass incarceration in the US, to corruption, political destabilization and violence in Latin America, Asia and Africa, to systemic human rights abuses across the world. It negatively affected the lives of millions of people. All of this while we waste billions of dollars every year only to create and fuel powerful drug cartels, while the goal of the war on drugs seems less achievable than ever: a world without drugs. How could this happen? The core strategy of the war on drugs is no drugs, no problems. So almost all of the efforts in the last few decades have been focused on eradicating the supply of drugs and incarcerating drug traffickers. But this ignores the most fundamental of market forces, supply and demand. If you reduce the supply of anything without reducing the demand first, its price goes up. This might lower sales for many products, but not for drugs. The drugs market is not price sensitive. Drugs will be consumed no matter what they cost. So the effect is to encourage production of more drugs and recruitment of more traffickers, which increases availability. This is also known as the balloon effect. Even if drug production or a major supply route is destroyed, the supply for the end user is not reduced. A perfect example of this is crystal meth. The US government tried to stop its production by strictly regulating the sale of chemicals used to manufacture the drug. This forced big meth producers out of business, but the unintended consequences were that thousands of small-scale operations started all over the country, mostly in small towns and rural communities, using chemicals that weren't regulated. In response to this, some US states wanted to reduce the supply of homegrown meth by regulating even more chemicals, which reduced small-scale meth production drastically. But the supply of meth still stayed the same. Mexican drug cartels immediately took over and opened big production operations. Their meth was even better than it was before, and they had loads of experience in smuggling. So all these efforts made meth production more professional, the drug more potent, while supply wasn't reduced at all. You can't win this war on the supply side. Not only are drugs widely available, demand unbroken, and some drugs purer than in the past, with a budget of around $30 billion, the US Drug Enforcement Agency has an efficiency rate of less than 1% when it comes to stopping the flow of drugs into the US and inside the US. For many minors around the world, it's as easy to get illegal drugs as alcohol. But it doesn't stop here. Prohibition may prevent a certain amount of people from taking drugs, but in the process, it causes huge damage to society as a whole. Many of the problems we associate with drug use are actually caused by the war against them. For example, prohibition makes drugs stronger. The more potent drugs you can store in as little space as possible, the more profit you'll make. It was the same during alcohol prohibition, which led to an increased consumption of strong liquor over beer. The prohibition of drugs also led to more violence and murders around the world. Gangs and cartels have no access to the legal system to settle disputes, so they use violence. This led to an ever-increasing spiral of brutality. According to some estimates, the homicide rate in the US is 25 to 75% higher because of the war on drugs. And in Mexico, a country on the front line, an estimated 164,000 have been murdered between 2007 and 2014. more people than in the war zones of Afghanistan and Iraq in the same period combined. But where the war on drugs might do the most damage to society is the incarceration of non-violent drug offenders. For example, the United States, one of the driving forces of the war on drugs, has 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of the world's prison population, largely due to the harsh punishments and mandatory minimums. Minorities suffer because of this especially. African Americans make up 40% of all US prison inmates. And while white kids are more likely to abuse drugs, black kids are 10 times more likely to get arrested for drug offenses. Okay, but is there actually something different we could do? Is there a way out of this mess? In the 1980s, Switzerland experienced a public health crisis related to heroin use. HIV rates skyrocketed and street crime became a problem. Swiss authorities tried a new strategy: harm reduction. They opened free heroin maintenance centers where addicts would be treated and stabilized. Here, people would be given free heroin of high quality, they would get clean needles and have access to safe injection rooms, showers, beds and medical supervision. Social workers helped them find housing and deal with other problems in their lives. The results were a sharp drop in drug-related crime, and 2/3 of the people in the centers got regular jobs because now they could focus on getting better instead of financing their addiction. Today, over 70% of all heroin addicts in Switzerland receive treatment. HIV infections have dropped drastically. Deaths from heroin overdoses have dropped by 50%. And drug-related street sex work and crime has been reduced enormously. So there are methods that are not only way cheaper, but also actually work instead of creating more problems. Drug prohibition led to a system that bulldozes human rights, costs vast sums of money, and creates a lot of human misery, all in pursuit of an unobtainable goal. After 40 years of fighting, it's time to finally end the war on drugs and move on to something better. This video was supported by the Open Society Foundations and by viewer donations on Patreon.
Drugs are bad. It's simple, right? But what if we were to tell you that the policies governments used to stop people making, trafficking and taking drugs were causing more harm than the drugs themselves? Not just in the countries where they're used, but places they are produced and transported through to. This is Lei. She's a farmer without much land, and times are hard. Most crops she can grow are difficult to transport to market and don't fetch a good price. So she's using most of her land to grow drug crops, which she sells to traders who come directly to her. In order to destroy her drug crop, the government sprayed it with chemicals, which polluted the land and water and killed everything she grew. She became indebted to the drugs traders. To pay this debt and feed her family, Lei's only option was to replant double the drug crop as soon as she could. However, the government intervened again by sending her community experts to help them grow alternative crops, on the condition that they all destroy all their drug crops first. The new crops were slow or failed. And in the meantime, Lei didn't have the money to buy enough food or the medicine she needed. So in desperation, she replanted the drug crops again. It's a futile cycle that isn't working. Meet Fatima. She has cancer. Her government is worried that some of the pain medicine she needs will fall into the wrong hands and be sold on the illegal market. So they implement tight restrictions for everyone. This means Fatima cannot get the pain medicine she needs from the doctor. And here's Maria. Her government armed the police and sent the army to fight the drug traffickers in her neighborhood. But the drug gangs fought back, and now regular gun battles between the police and gangs make it dangerous to go out. Her son was mistaken for a member of a drug gang and shot by the army. This is Umar. The same trafficking groups have started transporting drugs through his country to avoid getting caught on other routes. Now they use the money from illegally trafficking drugs to bribe the government, which costs Umar's whole country dearly. Poverty, violence, lack of access to healthcare, corruption. These are just some of the problems caused not by the drugs trade itself, but by the policies meant to tackle it. Enforcing them costs billions of dollars every year globally. Money that could be spent on education, healthcare, clean water, or so much more. It's time to rethink. Health Poverty Action is calling for a new approach to drug policy, which puts people's health and rights first. Click to find out more.
So in thinking about the international sort of drug policy community, the International Drug Policy Consortium has put together these drug policy principles. And basically to apply to the consideration of creation of new drug policy and drug policy reform, sort of what they think it should look like, right? So the first one, that drug policies should be developed through an objective assessment of priorities and evidence. So essentially, we should be researching the problem, identifying the high-level objectives, selecting the activities that the government can pursue and support to meet those objectives, clarify the role of all the departments, of all the agencies responsible for those activities, and coordinate mechanisms between them, allocating resources to support these activities with a clear time frame and scope of the strategies, and identifying any adequate indicators to evaluate the progress. So historically, it's been focused on punitive things, so things like seizures, arrests, etc., but they aren't really a good guide because they don't tell us about any sort of real drug-related health or social problems. So instead, we should be looking at health, human rights, development, and security as those sort of like evaluation points. The next one is that drug policies should focus on reducing the harmful consequences of illicit drug use and the markets rather than on reducing their scale. So pursuing the long-term objective of sort of a drug-free society, it's not a sustainable policy, and it has clearly led to the misdirection of attention and resources toward ineffective programs, while the health and social programs that have been proven to reduce drug-related harms don't have the resources and don't have the political support that they need to thrive. So similarly, things like crop eradication campaigns in producing countries don't stop the flow of drugs, as we've heard, right? It doesn't stop the flow of drugs into consumer markets. It does lead to significant social, economic, health, and environmental problems in those communities where the crops destined for the illicit market are cultivated. And the third one is drug policies should be undertaken in full compliance of international human rights law. So, for example, the right to life versus the death penalty for drug offenses and extrajudicial killings by law enforcement. Certainly, we have seen in places like the Philippines where extrajudicial killings have led to thousands of people being killed at the hands of the government for drug use. And the fourth one is drug policies should promote the social inclusion of marginalized groups and not focus on punitive measures toward them. So things like the widespread stigmatization of drug use, and by extension, the stigmatization of people who use drugs, that marginalizes individuals and entire communities. We've seen the widespread criminalization of drug use, meaning that people, especially young people, especially people of color, who are caught using or in possession of drugs, they're often left with criminal records, which lead to other exclusion from education or employment, limited housing options. It increases their vulnerability to health, social, and economic problems. So programs that focus on arrests and harsh criminal sanctions for people who use drugs and subsistence farmers have little deterrent effect, right? We know that. So it only serves to increase the exposure to health risks, criminality, and violence. So drug law enforcement activities and abuses can deter people who use drugs from accessing health and social programs that have been designed to actually help them. So in order to address these issues, a lot of countries are now leaning towards less punitive drug policies. So they're looking at things like decriminalization, so that the offense is no longer punished as a criminal action, and depenalization, where criminal penalties for drug offenses are reduced. There's also alternatives to incarceration and reviewing of the laws and sentencing guidelines to ensure that they're more proportionate in their penalties. Others are considering regulated markets for some substances, so legalizing some substances. Like we've seen prescription heroin in some countries. We've seen, of course, in the US, we've seen the legalization of cannabis in various states. So we're seeing this kind of pop up in different countries. The last one is that drug policies should be developed and implemented based on open and constructive relationships with civil society. So things like respectful, strategic, constructive, transparent, and accountable lines of communication should be created between the governments and civil society representatives in order to ensure that there's meaningful exchange of information, that the different perspectives are heard, and the conditions for a truly open, respectful, and meaningful dialogue with those most directly affected by drug policy can only be created if the governments remove those criminal sanctions for people who use drugs and farmers engaged in illicit crop production. So thinking about all those factors in sort of reviewing our drug control strategies. So it's definitely a lofty goal, but I think that they have a lot of very good points as far as their drug policy principles, and they're things that should be considered. Okay, so that brings us to our reflection questions. The first one is, in what ways have fears of social disorder, specifically when it comes to race, the economy, and social status, affected drug policy? So for the second question, you know, I've sort of touched on this a little bit here and there throughout this presentation. And as I've always talked about, you know, sometimes with our training curriculum, you might have to dig a little deeper than what some of the resources include. But I'm wondering if you got a sense of which drug use behaviors tend to be facilitated by prohibition and why that might be so. This next question, obviously there's a lot of different communities listed here. Certainly, if you're watching this webinar, you'll want to answer, you know, referring to all of these different communities. But in what ways have current drug policies disproportionately harmed one of these communities? And then, so the last one is, in what ways do you think drug policy has influenced the way that we view people who use drugs today? And of course, if you go to ssdp.org/justsayno, you can access the training curriculum, and the form to respond to these questions is on the top of each page of that document. So there's a link to that there, so you can submit your responses that way. Nick, did you have any questions about this lesson at all? Any things that that you feel like we missed, or just general questions you might have?
Let me think. I don't think I do.
Sounds good. Okay, so for those watching the webinar, of course, going through this training curriculum and finishing it allows you to become an SSDP certified peer educator, which allows you to present our Just Say No modules, which are harm reduction and drug education modules. And this is what the really cool certificate looks like. And, you know, thank you all for participating. Certainly you can go to our webpage if you have any more questions. And always, you can reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to help you along with the training or answer any questions you have about the program.